In the name of the one and only, we are back at your service, and we are following up on the discussion we had in the previous program, which was primarily on fascism and its role in world politics and, of course, in regional politics, focusing on the crisis in Afghanistan. That raised certain other questions that led us to explore things that lead to fascism, sometimes in a more politically correct language and terminologies, and sometimes in the context of certain plans and procedures in defining and establishing political entities, political institutions, and political units. And by political units, we mean states. How do we define states? In terms of the realm of their influence, in terms of their constituent components, and in terms of what really constitutes a state, in the sense that it had to be made up of a territorial component, a population, and a body of governance, as well as a recognition of that entity by others. So in that regard, the analysis that I'm going to share with you today are primarily in respect to where do we find a space for identifying ourselves in a political unit of analysis of a state, and whether the state is the traditional city-state or the super-states or the nation-states, the imperial states, and so on. That's where the issue of federation and confederation comes up. To me, the formation or the need for either a federal system or a confederate state is when certain political entities find it more comfortable to either be part of a larger unit or a smaller unit than they are generally defined. So let's go first to the definition and distinction of of these two terms, federation and confederation, and then we will try to apply that to a historical context as to what they are, and then we will proceed to discuss it in the context of modern politics. And we will get to the final point, which is its relevance to the crisis in the Middle East in general and those of Afghanistan in particular. By definition, the difference between a confederation and a federation is that the membership of the member states in a confederation is voluntary, while in a federal system it is not. To look at it from a different perspective, confederation is when independent states, due to certain policy prerogatives, certain priorities of interests, whether they be political, economic, or otherwise, decide to come together, excuse me, to form an alliance, and that will be a confederation. That even if that alliance is cancelled, those states would remain as integral political units. Therefore, a confederation is an addition, an enhancement, or a union of sorts. Perhaps the word union would define that better. It's a union in which a number of states come together to unify their policies, primarily in terms of defense and foreign affairs. In other words, a confederation is creating a larger unit by making one state part of that union. It's growing outwards. By contrast, a federation is to take a bigger unit and divide it up in terms of administrative units within that union. So a federation is generally dividing up the power structure, the administrative structure of a state, into smaller ones, where confederation is to unite an existing state with other existing states into a larger unit. So it's a kind of the difference is directional, whether you want to make a state part of a bigger unit, or whether you divide it up into smaller units and still keep it as a unitary state, supposedly. The concept of the unitary state may also be questioned in that regard, because a unitary state is generally referred to a state where the administrative structure is centralized into one government, one entity, one head of state, and one government. So it's more central or centralized. That's a unitary state. But unitary state could also be a federal state, where the administration of the various parts, sub-states, may be divided up, and yet in terms of generally foreign affairs and defense, it would still remain as a one political entity. To share some examples with you, the League of Mayapan, the Iroquois Confederacy in the latter part of the 16th and 17th century in North America. Those were Confederate states. The United States, before its Constitution, the formation of the Constitution in 1781 to 1789, before that period, was a Confederate state. So in the earlier period, when the United States became a country, it became a confederation. In other words, the 13 colonies were independent states. So at that time, when you would have said the United States, the appropriate verb for that would have been the verb are, that these were states, independent states, that were united in a confederation. In a confederation also, the there is no, the central government is rather weak and generally only symbolic. And it's the various states that have the more authority over the affairs of a state. And so there literally are many independent states that have come together. So the pre-constitution period in the United States was a confederation, and therefore the constitution they had was also called the Articles of Confederation. And of course, after the constitution that began in 1781, and the constitutional work and ratification within that decade in 1789, then the confederation became a federal state. And of course, during the Civil War, an attempt was made to reverse that, an unsuccessful attempt, and the United States remained a federal system, a federation. And then, of course, if we apply the same grammatical test, we would say the United States is. We would use the verb in the singular, referring to it as one political entity rather than a union of many political entities. So going back and forth between political terminology and linguistic definitions, we could also give other examples of confederations in history, those between Norway and Sweden at a time. In the Rhine there was a confederation, and there were other states later, for instance Egypt, Yemen, Syria, and Iraq at one point tried to become a confederation, although they presented it as a federation, which of course did not last much. Then by contrast, the federal systems are predominantly in countries such as the United Arab Emirate, India, and Bosnia-Herzegovina, and we have several other examples of that as well. So with that distinction being clear, let's move on to how we understand it historically. Like I said, that first there is a need or that is felt regionally for a confederation, and within a country for a federation, to either unite with larger units or to divide up the power that exists here. And generally these efforts are driven by either political necessity or by ideology, and sometimes by economic needs and so forth. Then we can move into other formations that might be more as anomalies. The most common one that comes to mind, for example, would be the German Federal Republic after World War II, when Germany was divided. East Germany remained as a unitary state, whereas West Germany was considered a federal republic. That federalism of Germany was not necessarily one that was born from within. Rather, it was a response to the outer reality. West Germany was, in essence, an occupied Germany, or at least it had zones of influence of France, England, and the United States. And because of these foreign influences, in a way, that formula for federalism seemed appropriate. Yes, there were states within Germany that had culturally identifiable characteristics, such as Bavaria, for example, that may have blurred the difference between a foreign imposed and a locally identifiable entity within Germany that was the Federal Republic. And of course, with the unification of East Germany with West Germany, the concept was simply thrown out, and now we only have Germany. My general feeling towards whether such a system works or not is as follows: that a confederation is a loose alliance, and its effectiveness is generally good in times of crisis, where large, self-sufficient, self-reliant, viable, economically and politically viable states come together to form a union. But in the case of confederation, it's the other way around. The existing units are divided up. Now, the viability of either in the federal form or in the confederate form, based on historical record, is more successful when it comes to super states. In the current situation, for example, the United States is a super state. It consists of 50 states. Whether these states are culturally identifiable and whether they distinguish themselves from, say, their neighboring states or not, is probably not so relevant. But because it's a super state, it is a successful federation. It was not a successful confederation. And the reason that the confederation was falling apart is actually the evidence it shows that the confederation did not work. We had the Soviet Union, which from the point of view of dealing within the republics of the Soviet Union, it acted more like a federation, because it was basically the Tsarist Russian Empire that was divided up into units, political units, for the most part for appearance sake, but in some cases also for strategic purposes vis-a-vis the West or the rest of the world. That within the boundaries of the former USSR, the reaction was more federate, whereas outside of those borders and within the borders of the Warsaw Pact, including certain independent states of Eastern Europe, it behaved more as a confederate state. And that was, even though that's not what they called it, but the extensive influence and interference of Moscow in the affairs of Eastern European countries in practical terms made that more of a confederation. But of course it was called only a pact, a military pact. But as I said, with regards to confederation, it generally is the defense or the foreign affairs matters that constitutes the main activities of a confederation. Let's move on to some other examples. Again, where we want to make a distinction between a political label and between the reality on the ground. China is one case where, in essence, it functions as a unitary state, but it gives itself the appearance of a federal state of the 4 or 5 regions that are somehow symbolized by the stars in the Chinese flag. Then, of course, we have the other Chinas, which is Taiwan or Hong Kong or Macau, which are essentially China's in their own right, but whether they fall within the authority of China or not, like Taiwan is outside, where the attempt is made to bring it in, and Hong Kong is administratively brought in, and Macau, which is in, but they want to give it the appearance of a separate entity. Those are the political games that are being played for different reasons that we need not get into that. There are other states that have become federal by the various necessities. Brazil and India come to mind. In the case of Brazil, it is the sheer size of the land mass in Latin America that has become part of this one state, where the federalism in it is a necessity determined by geography. That when we refer to the super state is super in terms of the land mass. India, on the other hand, is a super state in terms of population. Excuse me. So again, it's a super state that out of that necessity of putting 1.2 plus billion people within the confines of one state, so it becomes administratively not only more practical but necessary to divide it up. Canada is another one, which is a large state, and again it falls within the confines of what was called, within the confines of a federal system that is actually established on the basis of a confederation. But again, there is a degree of artificiality, and I don't mean to belittle the Canadians in any way, but that Canada, even though it's set up as a confederate system, it's becoming more and more like a federal, and that is the very heart of this part of my discussion, that the labels sometimes do not represent the reality. You probably don't need to have a passport to go from Manitoba to British Columbia, or from Newfoundland to Toronto or Quebec and so on. Whereas in certain confederate states that may be required. And the case in in Europe is another where I think the European the European Union is becoming more and more of I think it's somewhere between a confederation and a federal state. Brexit might have brought that into focus, where some people feel uncomfortable giving up the authority of their own nation state, and they feel like within a federal European system they would be losing that. For some reason nobody's bringing this up theoretically, but of course European states were independent states that came together first as a loose union in opposition to the Soviet grab of influence in Eastern Europe, the Warsaw and the NATO Pact in context of those military political alliances. It became a union, and then of course there was the European Economic Market, which was its economic component, and then it's the current European Union where they're slowly moving from a confederate level as an alliance and as a union to a federal one. And of course certain European nationals, if we can call them that, or the nationals of certain European states don't feel comfortable within that federalization, if you can call it that. Of course, in the case of China, could be both territorial and population. We give the examples of Brazil earlier. There is the case of Australia, which would be again the territorial, expansive continent that has become a country, and I don't know enough about its political system, but again, I think that the trend is more to move on from a confederate system, if there was one, to a federal one. And perhaps the experience of the United States and its failing confederate form of government before the Constitution probably serves as a model for this continuous trend of shifting from confederation to federation. Now let me refer to a different aspect of this confederation-federation argument, is that if countries are left to determine their own destiny, to carve their own niche in the polity of their own nation states or regional or global politics, they could choose either format. However, in countries that are weak by comparison, that are heavily bombarded by foreign influences, by foreign interventions, by foreign invasions, direct or indirect, by threats of wars, direct wars or proxy wars, by all these factors, when those countries decide whether they should go federal or confederate, the formula is a little different. It's different partly because of that old colonial adage that of divide and conquer. So if under the present circumstance around the world, it's the West primarily the United States and Europe, that are interfering and intervening in the affairs of other peoples around the world. It's there where the resort to either Confederate or Federate system in those regions is detrimental. In Latin America, for instance, since the 60s, the United States had continuously interfered and in a way tried to prevent the formation of any confederation. It had allowed for certain unions taking position either vis-a-vis communism or some other ideology, which were either initiated by the United States or heavily supported by the United States, or it was in essence with the blessings of the United States. So those are allowed. And of course, Cuba remained an anomaly to that and a major threat and a challenge to this U.S. dominance of Latin American politics, preventing the formation of confederations. There were earlier confederations, such as those between Venezuela, Colombia, and Ecuador. And if you take the trouble of looking at the color of the flags of these three nations, for example, the colors of their flags is exactly the same. It was a confederation that fell apart. But on the other hand, their divisions, in other words, creating some, dividing and conquering, in that context, things did happen. For instance, the separation of Panama from Colombia, which was done through or because of the interest of the United States, because the canal that was planned to be had there was basically an American global economic venture, and we had the contract, or the lease rather, for a whole century, until the time of I think Omar Trujillo back in the 70s and 80s, and his mysterious disappearance from the political scenes. But we will not go there. We're leaving that there. In respect to Africa, these efforts for any form of a union were primarily based on the interest of their European colonial powers. England established the British Commonwealth that comprised of countries such as Pakistan and India, at least for a time, and several other African colonies. And France responded with creating their Francophile unions of certain African states. And so those were again like either foreign imposed, or in a way shackles of colonialism that were colored differently, so they may appear to be less intrusive, at least on the surface. We had a more recent example of that when the Soviet Union disintegrated. An effort was made to primarily prevent the Central Asian Muslim majority republics to form a union of their own, a confederation of their own. And that's why the CIS came in to kind of, again, change the shackles. Remember, first the Central Asians were colonized by the Tsarist Russia. Then they were, through an effort of making it politically correct, renaming and artificially creating the republics within the Soviet Union. And then when the Soviet Union dissolved, countries such as Ukraine, Belarus, and Armenia, or the Baltic republics, they all got their independence. But countries in Central Asia were the Muslim majority countries from Azerbaijan all the way to Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan. They were all brought back. One could really say they didn't even leave in the first place, to be brought within the Soviet sphere of influence, partly to prevent the formation of either a confederal or a confederate system. And the likelihood of that was happening partly because the ECO project, the economic union that was formed with countries such as Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iran, and Turkey, and the 6 republics within, would have created the biggest economic union in the region. Actually, my PhD dissertation was an analysis of that economic and political integration in Central Asia, which comprised the 4 states that I mentioned, plus the 6 former republics. And the more there was that viability, and the more there was the possibility and the likelihood for that to materialize, efforts were underway in a rapid succession from Moscow to make sure that that does not materialize other than just the name. And perhaps for that same reason, we saw that while the other republics of the former Soviet Union, such as Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltic states, and Armenia, and Georgia, and so on, had economic reforms, they had political reforms, they had new democratically inclined leaderships, presidents, and so on. They had elections, whereas in Central Asia, the very dictators that were appointed in the time of the Soviet Union remained in power. In other words, nothing had changed until the death of Islam Karimov this past week. For instance, he was not only a symbol of that, but he personified Soviet authoritarian political structure, denying freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedoms, civil and civic freedoms, and so on. And therefore, we can refer to almost all of the leaders that, perhaps with the exception of Askar Aghayev in Kyrgyzstan, where they had elections. Most of the rest of them are dictators of one form or another that simply toe the party line. And by party, I mean the Moscow line, including those in Azerbaijan. And so this was, in a sense, an attempt to prevent the formation of a confederation in Central Asia, similar to those that the French in Africa or the British in the British Commonwealth had made those efforts to still keep them within their realms. And of course, the Russians are more successful because the Central Asian republics are landlocked. They do depend economically on the Soviet Union because these are, as single commodity producing countries, whether they like it or not, their economies are tied so closely to the Russian economy that they become merely satellite states and, in essence, an integral part of that. So their separation will be very difficult, if not impossible. So those were the examples of that we dealt with in how federal states came into existence, what foreign influences or factors were involved in that. Now, let me move on to a different area of discussion, and that is the relationship of the East versus the West. And of course, I mean Western Christianity and Eastern Islam. The religious factor that has played a major role in this adversarial relationship between these two cultures, let's call it that, or religious / cultural entities or regions of the world. There, in the post-colonial period, every attempt has been made by the West to prevent the formation of any confederation. We had certain movements right from the beginning of the colonial period. There was a movement called Pan-Islamism, which was a call to the Muslim masses that were colonized by the West to rise up against European colonial powers to liberate themselves. That was at a certain stage followed by a Pan-Turanism, which was when the Ottoman Empire was on the verge of collapse. And the Arab states rose against the Ottomans, the Ottoman Turks. There was a feeling that perhaps a more culturally identifiable, I should say more ethnically identifiable entity would be a better replacement for the Ottomans. So Pan-Turanism was to bring all the Turanian or Turkic or Turco-Altaic people from Central Asia all the way to Anatolia and beyond under one state. And those efforts were headed by, among others, by Jamal Pasha and Anwar Pasha, who traveled throughout the region to rise against Western powers and see if they could salvage the Ottoman Empire under a new label. Then came in this Pan movement was the Pan-Arabism, an attempt that after the Arab states were tricked into first, they were encouraged to fight against the Turks with the promise that they will become independent states. However, as soon as the Ottoman Turkey disintegrated, these Arab states were brought under the dominion of France and England primarily. In other words, the authority of one state was transferred to another without the very people in whose names these states were created, without them having any voice in that. And so then subsequently Pan-Arabism re-emerged in a few different forms, but again, just as the West made sure that Pan-Islamism does not materialize, and just as they made sure that Pan-Turanism does not take place, they made sure that Pan-Arabism does not become a reality either. And the attempts that were made for that happened at a transitional stage. And the transitional stage was that after the European War I, or World War I as it's known, the Pan-Islamic movement that began by Sayyid Jamaluddin Afghani and by Sayyid Ahmad Khan in India made its way into the Arab world through the thoughts of Rashid Rida and also of Hassan al-Banna, and they formed perhaps the first most effective party of Muslim Brotherhood in 1929. So within years after World War I and the independence of Egypt in 1922. Now, there was that trend of, again, creating some form of a confederation, and certainly Sayyid Jamaluddin Afghani's ideas were centered on the theme of a confederation. He probably deliberately and I'm sure with enough travel throughout the region and to Europe, could see the reality of his time more appropriately and correctly to call for a confederation rather than for a federation. And the reason being that many Muslim regions, states, and countries were not independent, and that it was okay in Al-Afghani's thought that you could create one state, you can gain independence for one state, or rather one state at a time, and only when enough states become independent, then they could create their own confederation. The time between World War I and World War II, that transition of an Islamically oriented, rather religiously oriented pan-Islamism gave way to a new religion, and the new religion was socialism, not necessarily communism, but socialism. That the emphasis moved from a belief system to an economic system to be serving better the welfare of humanity or nation states. So within a few years came the movement of Arab socialism or pan-Arabism. And here again, just as the Turks went on the basis of an ethnic identity in suggesting a pan-Turanism, the Arabs went on a parallel path of identifying a confederate system, or an eventual ideal confederate system in the context of pan-Arabism. And so those who emphasized the ideology called it the Arab socialism. Those who wanted to match it as a one-to-one with the Muslim Brotherhood emphasized it more as a pan-Arabism, but implying that that would be roughly corresponding to at least the Arab part of the Muslim world. By the end of World War II, the chances of the Muslim Brotherhood coming to power in Egypt were great. They had established a vast network of social services, hospitals feeding the hungry and sheltering the homeless and the destitute. In other words, if we can use a more an often misused expression of winning the hearts of the people, that was the orientation of the Muslim Brotherhood, the pan-Arabism of the Muslim Brotherhood. But the pan-Arabism of the Arab socialists thought that a more practical way would be to operate, to work this out through military, through the military sector, and therefore their membership expanded among military officers. That resulted in the toppling of the Egyptian monarchy under King Farouk in 1952, and the coming to power of Jamal Abdel Nasser as the real hand behind the power, although the first president was General Najib, who did not last very long. So that was, in a sense, a success in that a monarchy was overthrown. But the major problem with it was that it was focused on the internal struggle between the two opposite camps, the camps of the Muslim Brotherhood versus the Arab Socialists. And since the Arab Socialists were military officers, obviously they had more power and were able to weaken but not eliminate the Muslim Brotherhood. And that struggle that started back in 1929 and got on stage in 1952 continues to this day in Egypt. At the last change of power, again from the Muslim Brotherhood President Morsi to the military general Fattah Sisi, is a kind of a repetition, a repeat act of the reality that is defining Egyptian politics for the last 70, 80, 90 years or so. Now, this is what happened at the level of ideology. What happened practically was somewhat different. And that was that when Jamal Abdel Nasser took over as the head of the state, his role was very pivotal. One, in the context of the non-aligned movement with Prime Minister Daoud Khan of Afghanistan, Sukarno of Indonesia, Nehru of India, Tito of Yugoslavia, and certain African leaders who tried to carve a niche for themselves that they didn't have to be obligated into this East-West alignment, Moscow and Washington-centered alignments, that the third world needed to have a place for themselves. So Nasser became very popular on the global stage. The second thing was, as it has been the case with many third world leaders, that who modeled their governments, or at least had aspirations to create states on the American model, but when the Americans rejected them, they turned to Moscow. Ho Chi Minh was one such case in Vietnam, and Nasser was another, who would have preferred to work with the United States, but the United States kind of shunned them and ignored them, and so then they ended up on the Soviet camp, so to say. So in spite of all the attempts that these non-aligned leaders of the non-aligned movement made, in one way or another, they had fallen within that. And in most cases, people, heads of states deterred by the West, had turned to the East, with the exception of General Broz Tito of Yugoslavia, who was of the East, who wanted to turn West, or at least to show an inclination or a separation or distancing itself from the politics of Moscow, yet remaining a socialist in terms of domestic policies. So the situation since then has been as follows. that every effort that has been made in the Muslim world for the formation of a confederation has failed. And in my opinion, it has failed primarily because it is not being allowed by the powers that be. The first was the United Arab Republic, which was initiated by Egypt in collaboration with Syria. And with the United States allying itself with Israel, it could not allow such a formation on the opposite side of the Israeli borders, to the north and to the south or southwest. Then, of course, there was the symbolic addition of Yemen to this union, and that of Iraq. So again, if you would have looked at the flags of Egypt, Yemen, Iraq, and Syria, just like the examples I give in Latin America, these flags have the same colors, and they had the number of stars within the flag that indicated the order of their membership in the United Arab Republic. And for these external reasons that were geared towards dismantling that union, and of course for certain domestic reasons as well, that union did not survive. Syria became more independent, Iraq fell apart, and Yemen went its own way. And so for a long time, the United Arab Republic was the official name of only one country, Egypt, which in essence was probably neither united nor Arab nor a republic. If you look at the ethnic background of Egyptians who are not Arabs but Arabized Africans, North Africans. And then there was an attempt made by Colonel Gaddafi to create another union between Libya and Egypt and the Sudan under Jafar Numeiri. And of course, that didn't last, and Gaddafi made another venture into uniting its country with Tunisia by trying to erase the border, at least in his mind, if not on the ground. That didn't work. There was an attempt earlier in the 50s, initiated by Feroz Khan Noon, a Prime Minister of Pakistan, to create such a confederation between Afghanistan, Iran, and Pakistan. And of course that did not materialize because before long he was deposed in a military coup when that was staged against Skandar Mirza, the president of Pakistan at the time. So if you look at most of these efforts of a confederation in the Muslim majority states, they have all failed. And I'm not blaming the West for its interference in all of these cases, which of course is a factor. But in addition to that, there had been factors within these countries. Perhaps they hastily attempted to create a confederation. Perhaps they didn't give themselves enough time, and so on and so forth. But the Economic Community of Central Asia, comprising of Pakistan, Afghanistan, Iran, Turkey, and Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and Azerbaijan, into one large unit, was perhaps the most viable. And it was viable because it would have comprised, at least at the time, and we are talking about the 90s, it would have comprised of some 360 million people that had plenty of natural resources, natural gas and natural oil, and it had enough incentive for a new generation of technologically equipped workforce, especially in Turkey and in Pakistan, and enough in Iran and some of the Central Asian countries, that the viability element from economic standpoint was there. However, for the reasons that I don't need to repeat, they made sure that that just does not happen. But I'm mentioning this because this one was thought out. It wasn't hastily arranged. The heads of the states met several times, and the emphasis was primarily on economics, which again I think is a positive step, because in economics the data reality, the statistics, the numbers speak louder than emotions, whereas in politics the emotions take over and sometimes the economic reality does not match. But in either case, that attempt failed too. Let me conclude this discussion here, that we started with a general discussion and definition of a confederation versus a federal system. We discussed the historical background. We discussed the political implications in the European theater. We explained where it has been successful and where the labels do not match the realities, that sometimes there are federal or confederate states just in name. Then we focused on the attitude of the East-West, Christian West, Muslim East, and the dynamics that are at work either to prevent or to attempt the formation, and who's behind each. And with that, we are going to conclude this part of our discussion. And in the next segment, we will discuss, we will focus primarily on the Afghan politics, as to how that, what role it plays there, because there are at least certain rumors, if not plans, to turn Afghanistan into a federal system. And we are going to discuss from a political science perspective the viability and the promise of such a system. So until then, we bid you farewell. Have a nice day.